Hi everyone. Thanks for your patience while I'm traveling. I hope this will be a sort of interesting video for you to watch and learn a little bit more about Alaska and about the history of the United States in the Pacific region. So today we're going to be talking about colonialism in Alaska, and I will discuss a little bit about the history of the Tlingit people who live in Southeast Alaska, and then I will go in and discuss the history of Russian colonization briefly, and then we'll talk a lot about what happens when the United States shows up in this very different place in 1867. And it's a pretty interesting story. And so we'll kind of talk about some sort of key themes that we've already discussed in the history of the Western United States, like discussions of resource extraction and of Native American political and civil rights. So, some key questions I want you to think about over the course of this asynchronous lecture is, first off, is the U.S. occupation of Alaska, is this a sort of history of colonialism, or is this a history of settler colonialism, or is it both, or is it neither? Um, and sort of one key thing I'm going to want you to think about in sort of making that determination is this history of resource use and extraction. And one sort of different way to think about settler colonialism and colonialism is settler colonialism is often about securing the land, primarily for agriculture, though it can be for other purposes, and pushing Native peoples out of that land. The interesting thing about Alaska is that doesn't really happen. And it might not happen because of how Tlingets and other Alaska Natives deal with U.S. colonialism, but also might not happen because that might actually not be the purpose of or the role of the United States in Alaska, because regular old colonialism that Europeans practiced in places in African countries and India and eventually in China in the late 1800s. Alaska might be more like that, where the U.S. is there to get resources, to mine, to extract wealth from fisheries, this sort of thing. And for that, you don't have to remove the indigenous peoples from the land. In fact, it's actually quite helpful to see the indigenous peoples as potential workers for you in these industrial activities. Many historians have discussed that Alaska might actually be a case of industrial colonialism. And so we'll kind of talk about that. But I kind of want you to think about these different things because Alaska is different. Alaska is a little bit strange. It is quite different from other places in the continental United States. States like, or territories like Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Montana. I mean, Utah has its own weird history, but those other states, territories become states pretty quickly, right? You have states in those set up in those places by the 1880s, 1870s. Alaska will be invaded by the United States in 1867, but it will not become a state until 1953. And we need to ask ourselves the questions: why is that the case? Why do you have this incredibly long territorial period? Why, for the majority of Alaska's history, in fact, was it a colony but not an integrated state in the United States? And so again, we'll talk about that. But I just kind of want you guys to start thinking about that as we go through these slides and this larger history. So the first thing I want to discuss is that Alaska is an incredibly diverse place. It's the largest state in the country. And within Alaska, you have a bunch of different regions. And so you'll see this map of Alaska right here. You have mountain ranges that stretch across the southern part of Alaska and go all the way from the Aleutian Island chain in the west to south central Alaska, where Anchorage, the largest city of Alaska, is located, and then into the sort of Cascadia region, into southeast Alaska, where the Tlingit people live and where the capital Juneau is. And so we'll talk about those sort of different climatic regions. And then you have this huge territory to the north. And then to the west as well, where you have some flatlands. So what does the actual climate of Alaska look like? Well, you can see these sort of mountains form sort of distinct climatic regions. So if you go west on the Aleutian Island Peninsula, it is often like a subpolar oceanic climate, which is quite cold, but it doesn't actually get much below freezing often. It's often 30s, 40 degrees, incredibly windy, very rainy. Very few trees on this island chain. It's like very, very windswept. And the temperatures don't rise much above 50 degrees. So it's just this constant sort of cold, wet cold between 30 and 50 degrees. Then you go, to the far north, and you get that subarctic climate, right? Where you'll have winters that are -20, -30, -40, and how do people survive in that sort of weather? Well, you have to have adaptations for that sort of extreme cold. But the subarctic climate actually does have a summer, right? Where it will get up to 80 degrees on any given day in the short summers. And then you go down to southeast Alaska, and that's actually like a temperate rainforest, where it doesn't get those sorts of consistently like 30 or 40 degree temperatures as you have out in the western Aleutian Island chains, but more stays around like 50, sometimes 60 degrees, constantly rainy. And in the winter, will actually get a little bit cold. You can have some snow and stuff. But my point being, I sort of love climate and weather. I'm so sorry for that rambling. But my point being is that these different places require different indigenous peoples to have different adaptations to them, right? You're going to live a very different life if you live in a temperate rainforest, where your main source of food is salmon, hunting mammals in the interiors in the winter, to if you live on a windswept island where the land doesn't offer you many resources, right? It's the sea that in fact offers you a lot of resources. As these rich seas have whales and seals and sea otters and a bunch of different food sources for you. So that's sort of it's going to change the way Alaska Natives in these different places live. And in fact, that's what we see. The sort of Sugpiat Onagan who live out on the Aleutian Island chain live very different lives than the Tlingit who live in the southeast, and then the Inuit who live in the far north near the polar ice caps. So let's talk a little bit about Tlingit Ani, or Southeast Alaska, or the land of the Tlingit. That's what Tlingit Ani means. So this is an image I took of a river around Sitka called Kastihin. And Kastihin is sort of a key river around within Sitka that is used for resource gathering by the Tlingit. You can find actually big salmon streams or salmon populations that go through this river. And so during the sort of colonial period and also before, the Sitka Tlingit people, one of the groups of Tlingit people, would often harvest salmon at this river. And even after sort of Russian American colonization, it was still a place of harvesting salmon around like June and July and August. But the other thing that Sitka is known for is actually huge herring spawns, and so you'll have these incredible spawns of herring that are sort of almost renowned in Southeast Alaska. So people, Tlingets, would come from all over Southeast Alaska to Sitka to harvest herring roe in March and April, and there was so much herring roe it actually turns the sort of cove where Sitka is located milky white. And so that's sort of another thing to note about this land in Southeast Alaska. It's a lot of large islands that are all jam-packed together, and so you you have waterways and straits that go through these islands, but you have lots of coastal villages that are on the coast of these islands. And the way that Tlingit people live is you get resources from the rivers on these islands, you get resources from the ocean, and then you also get resources from the interior of these islands, where you can go hunt, gather berries, gather wood, this sort of thing. And this actually supports sort of a very rich, ecologically rich and diverse environment for Tlingets. And so they're able to actually accumulate a lot of different resources and become sort of a very powerful nation in Southeast Alaska and really expand their territory even before Europeans arrived to this place in the mid-1700s. So really quickly, I'm just going to say a couple of sort of important terms in Tlingit, or the Tlingit language, that you need to know for the sort of story. Is, as I already said, Tlingit Ani means the land of the Tlingit. Kwan means being from a place in terms of identity or connection. And often Kwans were sort of territories that had some degree of like political organization to them. And so when we're talking about the Sitka Tlingit, we're talking about people who live in Sitka Kwan. And it's like kind of like being from a state, but it's a little bit more sort of important in terms of your identity. But all Tlingets are part of a clan, and the clan is actually the main political unit in Tlingit society. And to make Tlingit politics even more complicated, you can have multiple clans in multiple clans, and you can even have the same clan in multiple clans. And so, for instance, the Kagwantan is a part of the Sitka clan, and is also part of the Jokut clan, which is up in the north. And so often these sort of clan connections, if you have a clan that's sort of straddling two different clans living in two different places, they become sort of a linking, a way to sort of link different Tlingit clans to each other in trade and in relationships. So that's, I just sort of wanted to give a little bit of that background because I'll be throwing those terms around while we talk about this larger history of Alaska. So, one thing I sort of wanted to mention about this is how Tlingit clans use resources. So, in sort of other Native American societies, you often have significant amounts of sharing and of sort of more communal structures. In Tlingit society, actually, sort of private and clan ownership is very integral. And so there are actually many different places that are named in the Tlingit language for sort of the resource that you can find there. And then each of those places are often owned by different families of different clans. And they will have sort of ownership of that place for generations. And so Tlingits actually have strong conceptions of property rights. It's just structured through that clan and family structure. And so I just want to give sort of a couple of examples of this. Look at this map. This is a map that was produced in conjunction with Tlingit elders and also an anthropologist at University of Alaska. And I just want to kind of go over a couple of these different places. So there's one that is right next to modern-day Sitka, and it's called Yautei, and it's Herring Rock in English. And sure enough, that's the place where lots of herring end up spawning right next to this rock in Sitka, right? There are sort of a few other examples, like for instance, New Tlain, which means big fort, and that was the Tlingit name for the fort that the Russians actually built on later on in this history. And the reason why I want to sort of mention this is that notice here, Tlingit language is tied to where you can find important resources. So we mentioned Yautei, Herring Rock. There's some sort of other places as well, like on Heaney, Dolphin Creek. You might be able to find dolphins there, right? Or for instance, other places like Gatkini, which means sockeye stream, which was a stream that was sort of a tributary of a lake called Swan Lake that the Russians end up building. And what you'll sort of notice in these different names is sort of you can kind of see the history of this place through these different names. You can see where different environmental resources are located, and also the history of sort of Russian settlement and how these different places are named as well. And so the whole point of this is I want you to understand that indigenous languages are often tied to have practical knowledges contained within them, right? So places of subsistence and where you can get foodstuffs and resources are tied in with your identity to a place, right? And so, you know, people are from the Shikakwan because they host the herring spawns at Yaote in March and April, right? Place becomes incredibly important here, and so when there is sort of attempts of cultural colonization by the United States, when people are forced to learn English and forced to forget their native languages, they lose access to this information. And so I just sort of wanted to put a kernel of that in there because this will become important when we talk about the history of the Tlingit people. So really quick, I'm going to move a little bit faster through these slides. I'm talking a bit too much for you guys. So around 1799, the Russians arrive in Tlingit Ani in southeast Alaska. And what's the goal of the Russians? Well, the goal of the Russians is to get access to furs. And they're effectively fur traders. So they want to hunt the fur-bearing animals of the region and kill those animals, take the furs, ship them off to China to make a huge profit. And that's how the Russians have actually been supporting their state for over 200 years by that point, is taking furs and shipping them off to China for a big profit. And they can make a lot of money doing that. And so what they start doing is going into the North Pacific and hunting sea otters, because sea otter fur is incredibly valuable in China. And so their sort of movement into the North Pacific lands them on the coast of Southeast Alaska, where they make contact with the Tlingits there. And they establish a settlement, which they call Novoarkhangelsk, right next to in Shikakwan, and this is actually the modern day town of Sitka, Alaska. And they attempt to try to take over this place. They actually fight a war with the Tlingits. But the Tlingits, again, are a really powerful native nation, and they actually get access to weaponry from other Europeans. And so they actually buy a lot of guns from the British and the Americans. They use those guns to hunt, and then when the Russians come, they actually resist the Russians with these firearms. And they're able to really fight the Russians to a draw in this war. And so what ends up happening is the Russians establish this tiny little dinky settlement off the town of Sitka, and it's not that powerful, and it is the Russians run into a lot of problems because they try to actually kind of bring their sort of foods into a temperate rainforest. So they try to grow wheat, they try to grow rye and oats. All of those fail miserably because it's incredibly rainy, and so the rain sort of causes mold and other sort of pests to come out, and it essentially ruins the crops. So they're not able to grow grain there. They bring domesticated animals like pigs, chickens, and cattle. The cattle don't have enough doesn't have enough hay to live off of, so the cattle kind of grow emaciated and die. The pigs can do okay, but the problem is the pigs are attacked by local ravens, which are pretty big, and the ravens will actually kind of rip off the tails of all these different pigs. And the other sort of issue with the pigs is the only thing to feed them is fish, and so when the Russians sort of kill these pigs for food, their flesh tastes terrible. So that doesn't really work. And the chickens are actually killed mostly by the ravens. And so it's like everything the Russians do to bring these sort of European like animals and plants here, they all fail miserably in this environment. So what this means is that the Russians can't actually self-sustain here. They have to have everything shipped from Europe basically for them to feed people. They try to sort of ship grain and stuff from Mexico and from Chile and other parts of the Pacific, and due to sort of international trading regimens, those trade deals don't go through, and so the Russians are kind of sitting here after about 10 years, and the Tlingits are trading with them, and they're considering just abandoning the settlement. And they're like, this is not going to happen. But what ends up happening is that the Tlingits recognize that the Russians actually have some trade goods they kind of want. And so the Shitka Tlingits, or the Tlingits of the Shitka Kwan, come to the Russians and say, hey, we would love to come back and live where we had been living on the coast of Shitka. And so we're willing to settle right next to sort of your settlement and trade you a bunch of stuff. But you have to recognize that we control the rest of the island, and we control everything outside of your small little settlement that's only about like 1 square mile long or wide, essentially. And the Russians sort of accept this deal. And so it's through this oral treaty that the Russians actually get enough resources to survive in Sitka. And the Sitka Kwan and the Russians almost become something like an alliance, essentially. It's through the sort of trade agreement that they develop close relations, and the Sitka Kwan will actually sort of expect the Russians to help them out in feuds with other Tlingit Kwans and clans, which is quite sort of an interesting history here. So this isn't exactly a history of colonialism. In some ways, this is a history of failed colonialism. The Russians failed to completely control this land. It's only through an alliance with the Sitka Kwan that they're able to survive. And so that the early Shitka-Kwan-Russia relationship is based off that trade agreement that the Shitka-Kwan established with the Russians. And you'll see on this map right here, you see how the Russians kind of live on this sort of little peninsula. They have this settlement. They have a few sort of farms and fields that go out in the direction around Kastihin, which is sort of a river that runs through these farms. But that's everything they control. The rest of this sort of fairly large island that's like 80 square miles, the Russians don't control it whatsoever. And so it's really it's the Sitka Kwan allowing the Russians to live on their territory. And for that, the Sitka Kwan get a lot of access to trade goods, right? They get access to weaponry, metal tools, cloth, especially like calico cloth, other made clothing, which is pretty helpful because they don't have access to stuff like cotton and other materials for clothing out there. I mean, they make their own clothing, of course, but the materials available in Alaska are much inferior to sort of what Russia has on the international market. So the Sitka Kwan gets access to lots of very helpful trade goods, and the Russians get some food. And that's pretty much it. The Russians get a lot of fish. The Russians get game. The Russians get protein, which they can't effectively get out here. You can ship grain for, months and months and months and months, and it's going to hold up. But you can't ship meat effectively out here. And so the Russians are living off salted fish. The Tlingits are trading them fish. The Russians are salting it in a sort of a place to sort of brine the fish near the town, and that's the sort of protein they're living off of for the most part. So this alliance, for the most part, maintains for a long time. So it's established in around 1821, and it lasts pretty much until 1867 with a few disruptions. And one interesting thing that happens is that the Shidkakwan starts to work for the Russians in the colonial town of Novoarchangelsk, and they work for the Russians for salaries. And so they come to a Russian governor at the time named Tabinkov, and sort of ask for work. Because they want sort of more money to trade for more material goods with the Russians and also to trade with the British. They're setting up sort of some trade relationships with the British down in British Columbia, where the Hudson's Bay Company has sort of set up some factories down there. And so they actually do some work for the Russians. They construct some buildings. They work especially on ships. Sometimes they work as sailors, and then they work unloading and loading up ships. And one reason why the Russians are sort of willing to employ Tlingits is because the Russians have a huge labor issue. They cannot get enough workers out to Alaska. And often the workers who come out there are sick for a long time. The sort of very rainy climate definitely leads people to be quite depressed, and they're very, very far from home. And so lots of Russians start drinking a lot. And in fact, the Tlingits will actually buy rum from the British and trade it to Russian workers who are getting drunk off this rum. And so, typically sort of the stereotypical thing with alcohol is that Native Americans are sort of it's acceptable to alcohol. There's many different arguments about it. Social scientists, they sort of argue about this as well as Native Americans themselves. But it's actually quite the opposite here. It's the Tlingits are actually getting Russian workers incredibly drunk, and they're making a good profit off of it too. But the Russians have a problem, and the problem is they're relying on the Tlingits too much. They need Tlingit labor to do these big construction projects, to man their ships in the North Pacific. But they also need the Tlingits to hunt for them, right? And to fish for them and give them food, because without that food, the Russians won't have any protein and won't have enough food to survive, or it makes it quite difficult. You kind of have to wait for shipments, and people are pretty miserable and cranky when that's happening. So the problem is the Tlingits and the Sitka Tlingits who live around this region have around 1,000 people or so, and of that, you might have around 30 or 300 men who can do this sort of work. And Tlingit women who also are sort of gathering foodstuffs as well. And the Russians are asking them too much. And so one interesting thing that happens is Tlingits realize they can actually probably get a better wage working for the Russians in the ports than they can selling the Russians' foodstuffs. And so what they start to do is they spend their time working in the ports instead of hunting or fishing. And so pretty quickly by the late 1840s, early 1850s, the Russians can't get enough food from the Tlingits due to the Tlingits, doing other forms of work for them. And so this actually starts to lead to a dispute between the Russians and the Sitka Tlingits, and this trade dispute where the Russians, instead of sort of realizing the fact that they need more workers, and this sort of colonial venture is not sustainable. A couple for a variety of reasons, a few governors start to actually sort of blame the Tlingits for them, and so they cut off their trading privileges, and this actually makes Tlingits quite angry, and a bunch of disputes sort of arise from this, and it actually leads to a huge battle between the Russians and the Tlingits, as the Tlingits sort of interpret, okay, you're cutting off trade with us, you're breaking this agreement, because remember, the original agreement was that the Russians were allowed this land if they kept trade relationships open. So the moment the Russian governor sort of cuts these trade relationships, he's going against the Sorel Treaty that was established 20 years ago. And that leads to an immediate battle between the Tlingits and the Russians. Sitka Tlingits almost take over the colonial town. It's a very close shave, and but the Russians are able to sort of repel the Tlingits. They come to the negotiating table. They sort of exchange some gifts, and that sort of ends and a few hostages, and that ends the dispute, and the trade relationship actually kind of goes back to what it previously was, as the sort of Russian officers who are running this colonial venture realize that they have to trade with the Tlingits in order to stay safe on Chitka. And so they reestablish their trade agreement, they reestablish that oral treaty, and never again will the Russians and Tlingits fight each other. And there are some actually historians who kind of argue that the Russians might have, quote, won this battle, but actually the Tlingits kind of get what they want out of it. And in fact, one historian argues that this is the Russians are actually becoming more Tlingit-like. It's not Russian culture that's actually taken over Tlingit society. It's Tlingit culture taking over Russian society as they begin to follow Tlingit protocols and Tlingit law. And they cannot enforce their understandings of the law on Tlingits here in the Pacific. So, what sort of industries are the Tlingits doing for the Russians? Well, as mentioning, they're sort of working in the port. They're working on ships. But one interesting industry they start to work on is the ice trade. And so there's sort of a brief period in world history where it's before refrigeration, but it's sort of after a lot of the world has been connected by these large trade networks. And so, say you're living in the mid 1800s, or even in the late 1800s. How do you get ice? Well, for the most part, you can't, because you're not getting ice in the summer. There is no ice around. There's no refrigeration. So, if you want a cold, generally alcoholic drink, you're not going to get it in the summer. But in this sort of brief period in the mid 1800s and a little bit in the late 1800s, a huge ice trade is actually set up where New Englanders actually learn how to pack ice from colder regions and ship it around the world so it actually can get to the location with the ice still intact. You take it off the ships, and then you have about maybe about a week to sort of use that ice and use it in tropical locations. And so the British actually start shipping ice from Norway down to India so they can have drinks while they're colonizing India. And the Americans start doing that here in the Pacific too. And so as Americans are out living in the Kingdom of Hawaii, which is another sort of key part of American colonization in the Pacific, many of them want access to ice in their drinks. So who's going to supply that ice? Well, Alaska's a great place to get that, right? And so what begins is an ice trade where the Russians actually they employ Tlingit laborers to go out on frozen lakes. So this is a picture of Swan Lake right here. It freezes over in the winter generally for about a week or two every winter. And so they employ Tlingit laborers to go out and dislodge chunks of ice, put it on rails that go to the sort of center of the town, and then this ice is sort of covered up by sawdust, and it is sort of preserved that way and packed together in an ice house, and then it's shipped off, often in the spring, to down to San Francisco or to Hawaii. And this gives sort of a nice profit for the sort of monopolistic sort of company running Russian colonization called the Russian American Company. We don't need to necessarily get into how that's necessarily run, but the Russians are they're trying to look for better ways to make money, because by around this time in the 1850s, the fur trade has kind of failed. There aren't as many sea otters around for them to hunt, and so they're trying to find other ways to make money. And one way is through this ice trade. And so, in this sort of crazy scenario. You have Sitka Tlingits cutting ice in Alaska that's shipped off to Hawaii. And so, if you'll remember, sort of in an article, Small Group Assignments, one of the articles that we went over was the sort of Hawaiian laborers in the California Gold Rush. This is another part of that sort of Pacific trade that is happening all across the western or eastern Pacific, or the west coast of the United States, and the mid to late 1800s. And there's almost sort of a triangular trade that's set up where like some timber and ice is coming from sort of the Pacific North. And from the south, you get sugar in Hawaii, and you get sort of wheat and other grains from San Francisco, and they're all effectively trading with each other. So the United States, the Kingdom of Hawaii, and the Russian American Company are regularly trading around this area, and indigenous peoples are key parts, are key workers in these industries. That are part of these trade networks. And so this is sort of another interesting history on that. And I should mention as well, the Russians also actually set up some coal production in southern Alaska around modern day Anchorage, actually. And then they use this coal to actually fuel their steamships that are running around Alaska. And so this is sort of a foreshadowing of the sort of extractive industries that will become a key part of the Alaska state economy and territorial economy under the United States. So we've talked a lot about the Russians and a lot about background, and I appreciate it if you guys have gotten to this part of the video. Now let's actually talk about sort of when the Americans arrive and what actually happens in sort of the late 1800s in Alaska. So the Americans approach the Russians about purchasing Alaska, and the Russians are actually also approach the Americans about them purchasing Alaska in the late 1500s. But the sort of American Civil War intervenes and sort of prevents the sale in 1858, 1859, and so it's pushed off until after the Civil War. And so in 1867, the Alaska is sold by the Russians to the Americans. And so what are some reasons for this? Well, the Russians kind of realize this is not a profitable venture anymore. It's costing them more money to sort of keep up their Alaska colonies than it's worth. The fur trade has been mostly played out, and they see the British as a huge rival to them in Alaska. And the thing is that the British are growing in power in British Columbia, and there's sort of this brief war in the 1850s called the Crimean War, where France and Britain and the Ottoman Empire fight against the Russians. And so through sort of a diplomatic arrangement, the Russians are able to keep the war out of the Pacific theater, but they sort of realize that the British Navy at the time is the most powerful navy in the world, and they realized there's no way they're holding Alaska if they have another war with Britain. And so best to just sell it off, call it a day, move on. And so that's what they do. They sell it to the United States. And actually, this is sort of a period where the Russians, the Tsarist Empire, the Russian Empire, and the United States have probably their best relations in sort of world history. American and Russian relations are actually quite warm around this time. And sort of, one sort of funny thing is that the Russians almost see themselves a little bit in the Americans. They're like, oh, look, we're colonizing Siberia, just like the Americans are colonizing the West. And so they kind of see similarities between each other sort of culturally, which is kind of interesting. But the big part of this is the Russians are selling a land that they don't control at all. You've seen the history I just told you, right? In Sitka, the Russians don't control this. This is a Sitka-Shikokan Russian alliance. And that trade agreement was essentially the Russians paying rent for the land they occupied in Sitka. And so the the Russians are selling Tlingit land illegally without telling Sitka Tlingits they're doing so. Tlingits are not at these negotiations between the Americans and the Russians. Other Alaska Natives are not there either. And so it's indigenous rights are ignored by the sale. And in fact, the sale makes the Tlingits, makes the Shikaquan very angry at the Russians because it's betrayal. It's a betrayal of their oral treaty, which, on the ground was enforced, right? So, but the Americans don't know what they're coming into for the most part. I've sort of tried to find evidence of this. The United States, how much did they actually know about Alaska? The answer is I cannot find any evidence that the Russians acknowledged that they actually did not control this territory in negotiations with the U.S. So the Americans show up, and they show up to find Tlingits basically are like, this is our land, what are you doing here? Because from the Tlingit perspective, okay, the Russians are leaving. Okay, that's the end of the agreement. We have our land back. Like that's the way Tlingits were sort of thinking about this. So the Americans come in with this sort of sense that they have purchased this huge, huge, huge territory. They actually didn't purchase it. What they purchased effectively was the right of conquest. It just kind of went unmentioned effectively. So what happens when the Americans show up? So initially, there was a lot of tension between the United States and the Shikaquan and other Tlingits. So the first thing to know is that the Russians, when the Russians leave, the U.S. Army takes control of this place. So it's not a civilian organization that comes in. It's the military. And they come in, and the U.S. Army, sort of, as we had talked about in this class, had fought in a lot of these different wars with Native Americans in the West. And so many of the soldiers who come here have participated in a lot of these different wars and have often participated in the Civil War as well, in their Union War vets. And many of them want to go home. Many of them don't want to be there. The U.S. Army was incredibly violent towards Native societies. We talked about the history, of like Chief Joseph in the 1870s, right? Trying to run away from the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army just relentlessly pursuing his band for really no reason, right? And of the sort of genocide of indigenous Californians and the indigenous peoples in California in the 1850s, right? And so this is the type of U.S. military that is showing up in Sitka, where the Shikaquan had maintained their autonomy completely from Russian society. So they show up there, and American military rule is significantly more violent. And so there are some incidences. There's one conflict in 1869 where there are American military ships that are off the coast and threatening to destroy the Shikaquan village that's right next to the settlement of Sitka. And the Americans also shell another Tlingit territory. They shell Angun in 1882. And so the U.S. military at the time is sort of very, very violent, and that's quite different from the Russians. The Russians at times were violent. Sometimes they fought wars with the Tlingits, but they never bring the degree of firepower that the U.S. Army brings to Southeast Alaska. But outside of these sort of violent conflicts, there are some very important continuities that happen here. So one thing that the Shikaquan is able to do is they're actually able to convince the U.S. Army that, hey, we had this pretty good foodstuffs and wood trade with the Russians. You should just buy our goods. And the Americans do, actually. They find it a lot more convenient to buy their wood directly from Tlingit traders and to buy foodstuffs directly from Tlingit traders. And so that same sort of market that was supplying foodstuffs to the Russians, in the 1830s and 40s and 1850s, of supplies food to Americans and to the families of U.S. soldiers who are living in Sitka. And so trade actually maintains its same levels and in some ways actually increases a little bit. And you start to get Sitka Tlingit women walking through the colonial town of Sitka and selling goods, going door to door, like door to door salesmen, and basically selling foodstuffs to American civilians. And so effectively, the Chickaquan reestablishes their oral treaty that they had with the Russians with the Americans. And it's through trade that the Chickaquan is actually able to make the U.S. Army a little bit less violent, because the U.S. Army starts to realize that the Tlingits are actually pretty helpful. They provide a lot of food and a lot of materials and resources for the U.S. Army. And if they didn't have access to those trade networks, the U.S. Army might not be, might have to struggle for resources and wait on shipments from goods from Seattle or Portland or San Francisco. So it's nice to have a nice trading relationship with people who live nearby, right? And so it's through this trade relationship that the Chickaquans actually able to maintain some autonomy over the course of the first 10, 15 years of American rule here. And the other thing that happens is Tlingits engage in pretty savvy diplomacy with the Americans. And so there's actually a couple of interesting stories I kind of wanted to go over here. So the Americans not only sort of arrive in Sitka, but they arrive in other parts of Tlingit Ani. And so one place they come to is the area of the Jokatquan, which is up north near some glaciers. And the Americans want to do this sort of scientific expedition where they want to sort of observe some astronomical events up there and also sort of explore Jokatquan territory. And the Jokatquan kind of talk with, send some sort of messages with the Americans through some intermediaries, and basically say, yeah, we will host you up here. That's completely fine. But the interesting thing is, while they agree to sort of host the scientific expedition, just that previous year, 2 members of the Jokatquan were actually killed in Sitka by an American settler. And one prominent member of the Jokatquan named this guy named Shki Dekla was a Jokatquan noble who was actually accosted by an American sentry and sort of forced to sort of surrender himself to the Americans after sort of fighting back against the soldier. And he was sort of very angry about his treatment by the Americans. And so the Jokatquan had some disputes to sort of adjudicate with the Americans. And so they accept this sort of scientific expedition to come up there, and some members of the American military were going to come as well. And they sort of see it as an opportunity to teach the Americans Tlingit law and how Tlingit law works. And so there's this really interesting meeting they have with William Seward. Now, William Seward was a prominent American politician. He was Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, and he's actually the person who arranged for the purchase of Alaska by the Americans in 1867. And the Tlingits know he's a very prominent politician, and they know as well that he, while he's sort of retired at this point, he's not Secretary of State anymore, he has a lot of sort of power over the U.S. military here, and is seen as sort of a very important person who might be able to sort of nudge the U.S. military to adopting Tlingit law. And so the Jokatquan does this sort of very interesting thing where they invite the Americans sort of to sort of a festival before the before their astronomical observations, and they invite the Americans into a Klan house in Jokatquan. And around 250 Tlingits are there, Jokat Tlingits are there. And in the center, they set up some chairs and some seats. And they have the Jokats, Jokat nobles, the leaders of the prominent members of Jokat clans, sit in the center. And they have as well William Seward, who is visiting Alaska for the first time. He's seen sort of the place he helped purchase, sort of on a trip for himself. And Jefferson Davis, not the sort of president of the Confederacy, but a U.S. Army general who is responsible for the U.S. military in Alaska. They both sort of sit in the center of this room with Jokat nobles, and they start a negotiation. And it's a very interesting sort of source. And according to William Seward, who writes this all down in his diary, what happens in this negotiation, William Seward writes that the Jokat nobles, immediately start saying, we had a dispute with another clan, and we need you to solve this. So we need you, Americans, to pay for Jokat people who were killed by another Tlingit clan. And effectively what happens is that the Jokat nobles are using this sort of incident, which actually never happened. There was never sort of a dispute between this Jokat clan and another Tlingit clan. It was sort of something completely invented. But they're using this invented sort of dispute as a way to teach the Americans how do you properly conduct diplomatic negotiations with Tlingits. So the Jokats actually ask the Americans for payment, effectively for those two Jokat Tlingits who were murdered by an American settler, and for the sort of roughhousing treatment that Shetitla had to undergo by an American sentry. They're asking effectively for reparations for their deaths. And this is sort of the Tlingit way to adjudicate disputes. If a person from one Tlingit clan kills another, there is either justice through sort of retribution killing, or there is often it is actually just adjudicated through money. You pay for their deaths. That is Tlingit law. So they're asking for the Americans to effectively follow Tlingit law here, and they very smartly send this appeal not to Jefferson Davis, who they've tried to support to get him to agree to some sort of payment for the people who were killed, and Jeff Davis previously refused. They send this deal to William Seward, and they target Seward, and they say, hey, this is how we pay for things. This is all. The only thing we're asking for here is money for the people who are killed. This is a reasonable thing to ask for. And Seward, sort of to his credit, says, General Davis, this doesn't seem like that hard of an ask. Why don't you just pay them? And the Jokats are in fact embarrassing General Davis publicly in front of all the Jokat clans to agree to this deal. And General Davis agrees to this deal. And this is actually how the U.S. Army starts to adjudicate disputes with Tlingits. They actually start to follow Tlingit law. And so Tlingit diplomacy is actually quite effective at this time. But there are some aspects of Tlingit diplomacy that almost are too effective. So in sort of some of these earlier conflicts, there were also some Shika Tlingits who were killed by the U.S. Army when the U.S. Army originally arrives. And so the Shika Kwan nobles also have a diplomatic effort with Vincent Collier, who is an Indian agent sent by President Grant to Alaska and Congress to Alaska to kind of see how's this colonization of Alaska going. And Vincent Collier is connected to the sorts of like missionary folks and people who are part of Grant's peace policy plan, right? Remember Grant's peace policy, how he was going to reorganize Native U.S. relations among ideas of peace and assimilation? Vincent Collier is one of these guys who supports this sort of stuff. So Vincent Collier shows up, kind of hears about how the U.S. Army has been kind of mean to Tlingits, and he's not particularly sympathetic towards the U.S. Army. And Sitka nobles recognize this, and they start lobbying Vincent Collier when he shows up in Sitka. And one prominent member of the Sitka Kwan, Anahuts, who was a leader of the Kagwantan, a clan of the Sitka people, has a meeting with Vincent Collier, and he starts saying, "Hey, the U.S. Army has been quite coercive. Like, we want the U.S. Army to start following Tlingit law." And the other thing Anahuts starts asking for is schools. And for Vincent Collier, this is like, this is wonderful. These Tlingits want to become American citizens. They want to learn English. They want to, maybe convert to Christianity. Hooray! Great. Let's get the Tlingit schools. Let's kind of get the U.S. Army out of the way, and let's assimilate the Tlingits and make them into good U.S. citizens. And that's sort of the interesting thing, is that the Tlingits have this history of working for the Russians, right? Well, that's good old-fashioned wage labor. This is what the Republican Party loves, right? Free labor, people working for a wage. And the Tlingits are doing this. And so often observers who come from the East and from the eastern half of the United States and arrive into the Alaska, they look at the Tlingits and they're like, the Tlingits are a little bit different from other Native Americans they've seen. They're not like the Lakota or the Nez Perce or people who sort of live on the plains, hunt buffalo, and have this very mobile lifestyle. These are people who want to work for a living, want to, they see them as candidates for assimilation. And that is both good and bad, because for Tlingits, that gives them leverage to make good agreements with the U.S. Army and prevent the U.S. Army from hurting Tlingit autonomy. But the other thing it does is it activates groups in the United States that are seeking to assimilate Native Americans. And so those groups become very crucial for understanding what happens in Alaska in the 1870s and 1880s. And it's in fact this sort of initial sort of diplomatic effort with Vincent Collier that sets into motion a bunch of different things that actually lead to aspects of sort of cultural genocide in Tlingit Ani. And so so Vince Collier sent this report to Congress, which is very negative of the U.S. military, but very positive of the Tlingit people as candidates for assimilation. And this sort of gets at some other interesting things here. The other Alaska Native groups are not seen this way. The Sugpiat and Unagan, who live out on the western Aleutian Island chains, and some live in Sitka as well, are actually kind of seen as Asian. And so this is where you start to see scientific racism kind of come in and sort of divide people up in Alaska and see them either as Native American or Asian or something else. The U.S. is trying to figure out what the heck to do with this place that they don't really understand. But Vincent Collier's report brings the Presbyterian Church into Alaska. And people like Sheldon Jackson, who is a Presbyterian missionary, set up missions in Alaska and set up schools in Alaska to try to assimilate Tlingit people and convert them to Christianity. And this becomes actually significantly a greater threat to Tlingit autonomy than the U.S. Army ever was. So a couple of very important changes happen in the 1870s. And so you've had this sort of situation where not many people have lived in Sitka. It's mostly been a sort of a base for the U.S. Army. But it's around this time that the tourism industry starts arising in Alaska. People learn about this sort of very interesting place where, that's like a temperate rainforest. It's kind of like another world. And people want to go and visit it. And American steamships start setting up lines that set up these almost like tourist destinations in Tlingit Ani in Southeast Alaska. And so you start to see steamships coming up and tourists getting off and kind of wanting to buy Tlingit goods. Send them home to their families, buy some Tlingit baskets, buy some Tlingit dolls, and engage in cultural tourism, right? And that starts to change Tlingit society a little bit as Chukka Tlingits begin making goods for the tourism industry actively, and that starts to become a part of the Tlingit economy. But this is causing problems because effectively U.S. tourists are now coming in, American tourists are coming into the Shikagon village, which previously had significant autonomy from American civil law. But as Americans start kind of wandering around Tlingit spaces, American civil law starts coming in to these spaces. And so this starts to become sort of an invasion of privacy of Tlingit families. And so while it gives sort of another economic niche, it becomes a way for American cultural colonization to start to come into Tlingit societies. The other interesting thing that starts to happen as well is the U.S. Navy actually takes over for the U.S. Army in Alaska. And the U.S. Navy will not sort of adopt the same sorts of agreements with Tlingits that the U.S. Army did. This one head of the U.S. Navy occupation, this guy named by the name of Admiral Beardsley, is actually a lot more sort of nuanced and savvy in setting up ways to control Tlingit society. And so instead of engaging in these sorts of agreements with Tlingits, he starts to co-op Tlingit nobles and heads of Tlingit clans. And he comes to them and says, I will make you a policeman so you can enforce American civil law on the rest of the Tlingit population. And we will pay you pretty well to do this. And so he actually starts co-opting Tlingit nobles to start to imposing American law on Tlingit society instead of Tlingit law. And this starts to slowly corrode Tlingit legal institutions and becomes sort of a key entry point for American cultural colonization. So why would Tlingit nobles go along with this? Well, one reason is that alcohol starts to become an issue in Sitka. And the alcohol trade, Tlingit men start sort of abusing alcohol pretty substantially. And some Tlingit nobles, like Anahuts, who I had already mentioned, who originally talked with Vincent Collier and asked for those schools, right? He really doesn't support alcohol in Tlingit society, or he wants to monopolize the alcohol trade for himself. There is there's a contradictory evidence here. He comes and talks to Americans often and says, we need to get alcohol out of Tlingit society. But I've actually found he actually purchases some alcohol from the United States, from the U.S. Army and American military a couple of times as well. So his true intentions are kind of hard to decipher. But the point is, he's okay with using civil law, American civil law, to stop the alcohol trade. And so his Tlingit policemen start coming in and destroying stills and destroying places where alcohol was traded in the Shikagon village. So Anahuts really becomes almost a tool for the Americans to engage in this sort of cultural colonization of Tlingit society. And so it's a complicated story. And this also begins the sort of routine arrests of Tlingits, and they're being arrested under American civil law by Tlingit policemen and then sent to jail. And so this this is really how Shitkaquan autonomy starts to erode over the course of American colonization. It's not violence; it's cultural colonization that does this. And so, and increasingly, Presbyterians have a significant role in Tlingit society, and so Sheldon Jackson sets up missionary efforts to convert Tlingits to Presbyterianism, and the Tlingits generally do not support this, and they don't like to join the Presbyterian Church. And so it actually leads them to go to the Russian Orthodox Church, because the Russian Orthodox Church was set up by the Russians during Russian colonial rule. And the Tlingits didn't really join the Russian Orthodox Church that much when the Russians were there. But now it's seen as sort of a safe alternative to the Presbyterians and a way to avoid American cultural colonization and learning and being forced to learn English and losing aspects of Tlingit society. And so Tlingits actually almost Tlingitize the Russian Orthodox Church and use it as a way to protect themselves from American colonization. And so slowly but surely, Americans begin to sort of take over Tlingit society. And one sort of another interesting thing about schooling and the learning of English is that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more with the boarding schools. Boarding schools, some of the boarding schools initially, parts of them sort of start here in Alaska, and Tlingit children are forced to learn English, and they're forced to sort of not speak Tlingit in school. And the Presbyterians are the ones doing this. And it will actually be enforced by the U.S. Navy as so the person who takes it for Beardsley, this guy named Captain Glass, actually requires Tlingit children to wear ID tags around their necks. And if they don't show up in school, or they can't speak Tlingit, or they can only are forced to learn English, the U.S. Army the U.S. Navy will go and arrest their family, their parents, for not sending them to school. And so this is very sort of coercive cultural colonization. And that's also what leads Tlingits to go to the Russian Orthodox Church and to try to use the Russian Orthodox Church as sort of a shield against this American cultural colonization. And so when sort of I get back from Alaska, we'll talk about progressivism and we'll talk about the boarding schools and what they do to Native Americans, because one of the reasons lots of Native American languages are not spoken today by Native peoples is because of that legacy of the boarding schools, where children are abused and effectively forced to learn English. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I just kind of wanted to mention that. So what happens here in Alaska outside of cultural colonization? Well, once American civil law has taken over a lot of Tlingit society, Americans start to steal Tlingit resources. So they start to steal land. They start to fish around Tlingit territory and send those fish to canneries, which the canning technology is invented around this time. And so you start to see subsistence resources that Tlingits used now mass produced for the American market and sent off for a profit. And this has sort of environmental effects, right? You have issues of overfishing, and Tlingit's not able to get the same resources they were able to get, back in 1850, 1860. And so as American cultural colonization comes through, it becomes sort of a spearhead for American economic colonization. But again, Alaska Natives and Tlingits especially are very savvy and always sort of open to new economic opportunities. So they start working in these canneries. They start, instead of engaging in subsistence fishing, they will engage in sort of market fishing, where they go out and they catch, halibut and they catch herring and they catch salmon, and they actually sell it to these salmon canneries. And so you start to actually see different labor unions that are actually set up here by Alaska Natives. And also by immigrants, and you almost have like competing labor unions set up in the early 1900s. And so Tlingits sort of wholeheartedly sort of embrace the sort of American economy because it's honestly not that different from the original Tlingit economy. I mean, that's the other interesting thing about this. But they still try to resist the Americans when it comes to issues like cultural colonization. And so effectively, the Tlingits adapt to American cultural colonization and try to preserve their society under it. And so with this whole sort of history, I kind of want to go back to this original question, and kind of I'll leave you guys here with this question. How does resource use affect our understanding of place? In terms of how does links between culture and resources affect how we understand a location and affect how we understand our own identity? Because for Tlingits, their connection with the land and their connection with the land through their language was crucial for Tlingit identity, and still is today. Tlingits today will still go out, and fish for salmon. They still engage in the herring catch and harvest herring roe in March and April, and they still live in Sitka, and they still live in places like Juneau and in Ketchikan or Ketchikan and Ingun. So Tlingits were able to maintain, if not all their land, they were at least able to maintain presence in their homelands. And that matters because they're able to maintain Tlingit culture and Tlingit continuities with their culture and with with places that Tlingits have inhabited for tens of thousands of years. And so, that's sort of another thing we should talk about. We're talking about Native American and U.S. relations. Removal to reservations. If those reservations are off traditional homelands, think about the disconnect that leads. When you're disconnected from place, you're also disconnected from language and you're disconnected from identity. And so that's sort of also another way. Alaska's different, right? Alaska Natives, for the most part, were able to maintain residence on their own lands. And through the Alaska Native Settlements Claims Act, they were actually able to keep control of a lot of their lands in the 1970s. And we'll talk about that sort of larger issue with Native American civil rights in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s later on in the class. But Alaska's a little bit different. And I want you to also think about this sort of very long asynchronous lecture as as almost a bridge to our study of the U.S. empire, because Alaska in some ways is this hinge between a settler colonial society, which is trying to get access to land and remove Native peoples off their land, to a almost imperialist colonial society in the Pacific, when the United States will take over Hawaii and the United States will take over the Philippines and fight a war with Spain for those colonies. And it starts a huge internal debate in the United States. Will the U.S. be a colonial empire like Britain was and like France was in the late 1890s and the 1900s? Or is the U.S. different? Is this incompatible with what it means to be a democracy? And so Alaska serves as this hinge from U.S. sort of settler colonialism to U.S. imperialism. And so you can kind of see how it's a little bit different from other places. And so I want you to kind of start thinking about these questions of resource use and also about these questions of empire and what does the U.S. empire look like, and how does that sort of intersect with the history of the United States in the Pacific. And so we'll talk about that sort of when I get back from this trip, and in a couple of weeks, we'll kind of engage in this discussion of U.S. empire. So thank you very much. I hope you guys found this interesting. I will try to post a video or two from when I'm in Alaska to kind of share some pictures and stuff. But I hope you guys found this interesting. And yeah, have a wonderful week. Take care.